Okay, so let's talk about another concept called syncopation. So let's say I had my meter, I had it 1/4, and it sticks to 1/4 most of the time. But there's just a few places where it decides to change its downbeat for some reason. It's not in the place where it should be. That's going to be called a syncopation. So what's going to happen is going to be like 1 2 3 4 1 2 3 4 1 2 3 1 2 3 4. It's going to do something like that. It happens a lot in a lot of different kinds of music, not so much in others. So you'll see it more if you map certain genres, but there's actually an instance of syncopation in Ode to Joy that I'd like to show you, and I'll play it first and see if you can find it yourself, but then I'll play it again and point it out by counting the beats. So let's see it. Okay, so now I will count it out, so that way everyone will be able to figure it out. 1 2 3 4 1 2 3 4 1 2 3 4 1 2 3 1 1 2 3 4 1 2 3 4 1 2 3 4 1 2 3 4. Oops, okay. So hopefully that syncopation was obvious. So now when we're talking about, well, what are the strong notes, you might say, okay, well, I have to rethink what the downbeat is to figure out what that strong note is because it's syncopated. So this matters a lot more not when it's a 1-1 syncopation, whereas the downbeat would change to here as a note to joy. Sometimes the syncopation happens on the offbeat, and that's going to throw a lot of people off on especially lower difficulties, which is not maybe something you shouldn't map then, but in higher difficulties as well, having a syncopation on the offbeat can be a little odd for the rhythm. So we'll have to make sure we account for that and not put slider ends in the wrong positions. Okay, so we'll get into an example of syncopation in the editor a little bit later, but for right now I want to talk about harmony and melody. So what do I mean by that? Well, let's say I have a band, and in the band I have someone who plays a piano, I have someone who plays a guitar, I got a singer. They're all playing different music, really. They're all coming together to form one piece of music, but each individual instrument or track is playing different pitches, different rhythms. And so that's going to be important when we try to map. We're going to be, well, which one do I really want to key into? Because if I can't really cover all of them. You're going to have to focus on onto one of them. And so what we're going to do is divide some of it into something called the harmony and something that's also called it's something else that's called the melody. So this idea that you have multiple sounds going on is called a polyphonic song. You have multiple poly sounds, phonic. So if I have multiple instruments, it's a polyphonic sound. If I have a guitar solo, let's say that would be a monophonic song, meaning one sound. So to give you an example of what I think is a good song to illustrate harmony and melody, I'm going to go to a song called Linus and Lucy, which is in Charlie Brown, so you may have heard it before. And what I want you to observe is that you're going to have, kind of in the other videos, we had blue notes on the left side of the piano and green ticks on the right side of the piano. And this is going to be the different harmony and melody because they're going to be playing different sounds, really. So let's give it a listen and see how it goes. Okay, so that's probably enough to get the idea. You have the higher pitched notes are generally being called the melody. They're more in the foreground. And so the lower pitched notes on the left are going to be the harmony, because they take more of the background. So this side is the harmony and this side is the melody. And so when we're mapping, we can really only choose between the two, because you might have, let's say for here, this might be mapped as a long slider, whereas this might be a slider and then a few circles. So you'd have to kind of weirdly transition in your head away from the melody into the harmony if you were trying to capture both. It sounded kind of strange. So really, as long as you pick one, if you say, hey, I think the melody should be mapped as opposed to harmony, or I think the harmony should be mapped as opposed to melody, and you stick with it, it'll be okay. There are times, though, that you really should transition away from the melody into the harmony, and there are times where you should transition away from the harmony into the melody. And so there's actually an example in this song that I'd like to point out and where it'd be a good place to do that. So first off, we can see that at the beginning of the song, only the harmony played, so you really don't have a choice. Either you don't map anything, or you actually just go with the harmony. Okay, so if you noticed right there, there was this long note held in the melody, this part here. So this would be, if you were strictly mapping the melody, you would have this really long slider or a really big pause, and that's generally not that fun to play in OS, because this is a rhythm game. We'd like to click things and keep the rhythm. So this is an instance where you would probably shift away from the melody if you're following it into the harmony, and maybe hold it for a little while, but then switch over and start picking up these notes. And we'll get into an example of how you would do this in the editor in just a second. But I'll finish up on times where you would shift away from the harmony into the melody. So if you listen to this song a lot, you can notice that the harmony is doing the same thing over and over again. Maybe shifted up an octave or two or so, but it's really doing the same thing. It's getting a little bit repetitive. And so to break some of that repetition, you might want to switch into the melody during parts where the melody is doing something exciting. Okay, so here is how I mapped Minuet, focusing mostly on the melody. And towards the end of the section that I've mapped, I'd switch away from the melody to the harmony. So I'd like to show you an example of how I think that's nicely done. So let's go ahead and show it. Remember that this is focusing mostly on the rhythm, the structure, and the flow of the actual position of the objects doesn't really matter for what I'm doing. I haven't focused on that. Okay, so hopefully you heard it towards the end. That I've been following the singer for the most part until this measure here, where originally the harmony starts to kick in here. It goes dun 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 dun, and that's really what I'm following now. But what makes this and again, it's for the same reason that having a long slider here to go with the melody, like if I for some reason did this, it would just kind of be very strange to hold a slider for that long. So having this might be more appropriate for higher difficulties. But another nice point, at least, about what happens here is that the melody and the harmony are doing the same thing along this point, along this beat. And so that gives the player time to kind of focus, oh, I was going with the melody, but now I understand that there's a harmony going on as well. I can kind of keep track of that, and now I'm starting to get the idea that I might want to switch into that. Whereas if all of a sudden you start transitioning into the harmony, without really giving this kind of transition period of an overlapping rhythm, kind of, then your player is going to be might be confused as, oh, hey, wait, we changed different to the harmony. I wasn't really expecting that. Whereas this, the transition is a lot more obvious. And it's not going to be always there's not going to always be something like that for every song. So you might have to like switch in if you really need to, but see if there's something like that that you can use to transition between the two. So now I'd like to talk about an example of syncopation. So to do that, I'll go to my other song. So there's a lot of syncopations going on here. And so I'll play it first, and then I'll try to point it out where the syncopations are and how they are mapped or not mapped correctly. Okay, or well, correctly as in how I would map them, how I think, I've come after through my experience to think what it ought to be. Not to say that I am correct in how I'm doing things. But okay, let's listen to the song. Okay, so I'll slow it down because it was a little fast, but there were two syncopations that we kind of have to look for. So slow it down, and let's listen again. Okay, so let's just take a look at that first one. There's going to be a syncopation in the harmony, and there's not going to be a syncopation in the melody. So it's going to happen around here. The harmony is going to kick in here, and the singer is not. So let's listen to it again. Okay, so yeah, that's going to be a problem, because if the player thinks that they're going with the harmony, they're going to be confused that there's no applicable note here. Whereas if they're going with the melody, they're going to want this kind of, they're not going to want a note here because there's no strong note here in the melody. So we at least see that there is an example that there's some kind of competition between the harmony and the melody and what note should be played. So this is for you to kind of think about and say, hey, am I mapping the melody? Should I stick with that? Is there a better reason to map the harmony? Is there a better reason to syncopate there? Whatever. So there's also another syncopation that's going to go on. Okay, so as we saw, there's no note on the downbeat, right? So the reason is because there's syncopation going on, and really the syncopation is here, but there's no note in either the harmony or the melody, so we can kind of ignore the fact that this is the quote-unquote downbeat of the song because of the white tick. We know that the downbeat has shifted here because it's syncopated. Okay, so to kind of show you again. Hold on. Yeah, and again, it's syncopated here as well. The syncopation that's carried over throughout the measure. And so this is mapped fine depending on which one you want to go with. If you were more focused on the harmony, you would change this. If you're focused more on the singer, this is going to be okay if you emphasize it correctly. Okay, so that's everything I wanted to talk about. I hope you guys learned something about separating music into its tracks, into the harmony and the melody. Get an idea of where the strong notes are versus the weak notes are, and how you might want to go about emphasizing that in maps. And maybe you picked up some vocabulary to use in when you're talking to other people about maps. So yeah, I hope this has been helpful, and thanks for watching.